Well, hello everyone, and welcome to season 4, episode 2 of the Language and Power podcast. Today we're talking about COP28. We continue to talk about COP28, and we're talking about opening speeches, press conferences, and remarks at the World Climate Action Summit, which is being held at the COP28 conference in Dubai. We're going to talk about 2 speeches today. First of all, we've got a speech on the opening day by the COP president, Dr. Sultan Al Jaber. That was held. The speech was on the 30th of November. We're also going to look at a speech or press conference where there's a little bit of debate about what we should call it, by the UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, which was given on the 1st of December, so the following day. We're going to start off with the speech by Al Jaber, and this is as the president. In previous episodes we've looked at speeches by the COP president, so this is the person who's kind of the executive in charge of running things, the chairperson, I guess you could call it, of the whole conference. And we had Alok Sharma in Glasgow that we looked at a little bit in previous episodes. But this speech by Dr. Sultan Al Jaber came amidst some controversy. Tom, what's been happening with Al Jaber and his speech and the context for the speech?
Well, yeah, there's been a couple of things, really, hasn't there? There's been the announcement that the United Arab Emirates have been using COP to hold behind-the-scenes negotiations about actually increasing oil and fossil fuel exploration and rights involving the national oil company of United Arab Emirates, of which Sultan Al Jaber is the chief executive. So this has caused there was a lot of controversy about having someone with that role actually taking the presidency of the COP in the first place. But very interesting. But also connected with that, there was also yesterday, after the speech, there was further revelation, if you like to use that term, of a meeting that Al Jaber was in with Mary Robinson, the former president of the Republic of Ireland, in which he claimed in a bit of a heated moment that there was no science to suggest the getting rid of fossil fuel emissions was necessary in order to bring down the global temperature to the appropriate number. So sort of denied the science, and there's no science saying this, which is also hit the press, and also very interesting. The video of this conversation has been released, which gives some interesting background to this. So from before it started, there was all this controversy. That I think one of the things I want to point out about the controversy, it's really interesting because if we're talking about undermining scientific arguments or fake news or a lot of the climate stuff, one of the ways people go about it is by undermining the people involved in the discussions rather than attacking the science itself. So I've been thinking about this and thinking that this revelation that the United Arab Emirates might have been involved in using the COP for trade deals so you've got on the one hand people like Greta Thunberg who think COP is all blah, 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 as she said last time round. This will serve her and other idealists to undermine COP, saying it's people, look, they're saying one thing and they're doing another. It's totally worthless. We need more action. But I was also thinking, you get the other people. I've seen tweets recently or memes on Facebook saying, I don't want people flying into conferences on private jets telling me what to do with my personal heating. So it'll be used by people as change deniers as well to discredit this. So I think that's an interesting point that touches on some of the things we've talked about before. But I've wandered off our original script thinking about this just now, but there are some really interesting things that we come up in both these speeches. And as you say, the genre of Rishi Sunak's is under debate, which gives it more or less credibility, depending if it was a speech at the COP or one he just happened to make on his own.
Well, I'll just say a little bit about that. What we're talking about is we've got we'll put links to these in the notes, and so you can have a look for yourself. But on the UK government official website, Rishi Sunak's speech is titled PM Speech at COP28 Climate Summit, 1st of December 2023. subtitled Prime Minister Rishi Sunak delivers a speech at the COP28 Climate Summit 2023. And then we've got a transcript of the speech exactly as it was delivered. So we'll put a link to that in the show notes. But if we look at the YouTube video of this event, it's very clearly a press conference. The YouTube video that we'll also put a link to, it clearly describes it as a press conference. And you can see in the background that this is not given on the main stage of the COP meeting. It's given in something that looks like the British delegation's booth or tent or whatever, however the setup is there. But it's given somewhere quite differently. And the whole tone of things, it sounds like a press conference. Indeed, half of the speech is given over to talking about other matters that are on everybody's mind at the moment, which is the situation in Gaza. So Sunak gives half his speech at COP28 on the situation in Gaza. And then there are questions from the press. So it very much looks like a press conference. However, the official government line from the UK is that they're describing it as a speech. Are we being kind of too pedantic about this?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah.
I think it's all to do with credibility and the force behind arguments to where this comes from. And if the government wants it to seem like an official speech, that sort of gives it more credibility and gives Sunak more credibility. But at the same time, there's been a lot of astucia, a bit of fuss and discussion about the fact that Sunak apparently spent longer on the plane going there and back than he actually stayed in the UAE. And so I suppose, why would he actually need to do a press conference at that time and place anyway, given that he was there for such a little amount of time? In a way, claiming it's a speech gives him more credibility in some ways, but also seeing him talk about the UK government's very modest, to be honest, environmental achievements over the last years, standing at the COP. In some ways, I suppose that was supposed to give him more credibility. The fact that he was actually very briefly there, at least they had to catch him on film there to give him a bit of credibility. So. And there's all sorts of, I think it has a lot to do with cultural capital and stuff. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, the other interesting thing that we notice as well is that on the press release website, on the UK government website, there's a photograph of Sunak outside number 10 Downing Street in the UK, not at COP. And the very first words of his speech are, "I'm here at COP28," and there he is under a picture of him, photograph of him at number 10. So yeah, there's some very interesting spinning, shall we say, going on around Sunak's contribution there. But we were going to talk about the argumentation. So, and if we perhaps go through each and see about argumentation. So argumentation is something that we look at. Some people very, very specialize very much in how to analyze argumentation in discourse analytical circles. So we thought we'd have a look at that. And one of the ideas I guess the main idea, and jump in, Tom, if there's anything to add to this. Argumentation. So looking at the structure of an argument. So recognizing that arguments and the production of argumentation, so creating an argument, has got different components. And you can look at those components and sort of test them in an analytical sense. And one of the things that you can look at, if we think about the work of Ruth Vodak, is to think about topoi or grounds. What grounds are you basing your argument on? And we've got a couple of different ones here. There are similar grounds that each man gives for the arguments that they're making. And we'll perhaps get to the point, I suppose we're kind of burying the lead a little bit here, but we'll get to the point about what they are arguing for a little bit as we go through the detail of the speech. But the grounds that they're arguing on is Al Jaber has a pragmatic grounds. He's saying we're going to do things on a pragmatic ground, but he also has a kind of moral ground. We should do things because we don't want the global south to be overburdened. So there's a couple of grounds on which he bases his arguments, and then on those grounds he builds a sort of a description of what the situation is like now, and therefore what should we do about it based on the fact that we want to do things pragmatically and in a kind of moral sense.
That's
so
right.
Should we have a look at that? Yeah, go on, Tom.
No, carry on. We'll do.
Well, should we have a look at what he says in this speech? Did you have some bits that you wanted to pick out on the?
but
Al
not in
Jaber.
such an ordered way. I was just picking out tidbits, which I know is against the rules, strictly speaking, but this is
We're not
radio.
Yeah, we're not doing academic stuff.
Yeah.
Pseudo-academic. Yeah.
Well, the one, I mean, as you say, I think these two themes come together, and I'll try and find out the bits, is he makes the point that people should not have to choose between. He says this, the presidency is committed to unlocking finance to ensure that the global south does not have to choose between development and climate action. And this is a very strong theme that we see quite often, that less developed countries can't afford to develop and join the developed world if they're not allowed to continue using fossil fuel and stuff like that. And it's often used, it's a solid argument in some terms that, that the very developed countries have, modernized through the use of fossil fuels are now turning around and saying you can't do this. And so it's leaving the developed countries in this situation. And Al Jaber is saying they shouldn't have this choice, shouldn't have to be forced into this choice. But there we get these two topoi then, that all decisions should be made that are benefit to all countries. No one should be left behind. This is a strong theme or topos that's coming through, that it should be to the benefit of all, and also to be pragmatic. But it's often used, he's very much using it in his speech here to say that the already developed nations, the global north, are using their power to dictate the way in which COP has been going, and that this shouldn't be going on anymore. So he's using it to talk about climate imperialism, and so he's setting up this distinction between the North and the South in quite antagonistic ways. And so he's using the argument that we need to continue with certain things, including fossil fuel extraction. Interesting enough, seeing as that's where his country makes a lot of money, and he's the head of a company that does that. So he's creating this argument, but he's sort of using it as a way to justify the continued use of fossil fuels alongside other pragmatic measures, to be fair. But that's one of the things he clearly says. It should not be a choice between development and climate action.
Yeah. In that particular bit, there is something else, which is that he talks about the 100 billion loss and damage fund, which has been something that COPs have been trying to gain agreement on. And one of the headlines that came out of this very early on, this COP28, was that they agreed to do a loss and damage fund. So even here, there's a I guess a practical, pragmatic kind of argument. We don't want to do this, so we'll give them money. We'll make sure that there's money available on that. And he talks about the most vulnerable. So on loss and damage, I know how important this issue is to the parties, particularly the most vulnerable. So that's where he brings in this kind of moral argument tied in with a kind of practical solution. We'll create this fund and open it up to people in the global south. I don't know how other people will have to sort of make a judgment on whether that amount of money is sufficient or adequate and stuff. But we're just kind of, I guess, pointing out at this point that those are the kinds of argumentative bases that he's talking about. There's a similar stream or theme in the Sunak speech. He's talking about, on moral grounds, that now the less wealthy should not have to pay for climate change actions. So he talks about, so yes, we'll meet our targets, but we'll do it in a more pragmatic way. So he's specifically mentioned pragmatism, which doesn't burden working people. So this argument, the grounds for this argument are that we're going to do things in a certain way because it's practical and because we don't want to burden working people. So he's kind of borrowing that type of argument from Al Jaber to say that the poorest shouldn't have to pay. This time it's people in the global north who are in a wealthy country, not...
No, so they're both using a similar argument, aren't they? That people are being left behind. And this can be a good argument. Of course, it's a solid argument. There should not be a scenario where people are left behind. But it's also one that can be used in ways you're saying. So, for example, when Sunak used it as well, this very much latches on to a sort of populist some anti-climate activism, anti-climate change activism sort of is latched onto by populist politicians such as Trump, obviously, but also the Tories have been doing it to an extent. And the idea, instead of we're not investing all this money, we're not making all these changes because it leaves the average Joe behind who's being forced into this against their will. So it really resonates with a sort of sector of society that sees politicians as meddling in their lives and that they should be allowed to get on with whatever they want. So they're both taking what's a reasonably creditable argument, using it very much the basis for more spurious arguments that build on it.
Yeah. I mean, what we sort of, when we were talking earlier, we were talking about them appropriating this argument because, on the absolutely, why should the poorest take the burden, to use Sunak's words, of adjusting to combating, mitigating climate change? Why should they? Why should anybody have to do that? And we said they're appropriating it, and I think you can see this particularly in Sunak's speech. If we kind of look at the details here, he's talking about, so if we remember in Al Jaber's argument, and we're not saying that this is perfect, I'm not saying it's perfect in any way, but he's kind of saying we don't want to have the global south having to choose between development and global action. He goes on to speak about the new 100 billion loss and damage fund. So giving money, producing money for people. Whereas in Sunak's case, he talks about, we're getting to the point of his argument. As I said in September, he says, we won't tackle climate change unless we take people with us. Climate politics is close to breaking point. The British people care about the environment, and so far, so good. They know that the costs of inaction are intolerable, and we can agree with that. But they also know that we have choices about how we act. All so far, so good. All very sort of self-evident, not really saying much controversial. So yes, we'll meet our targets, but we'll do it in a more pragmatic way, he says, which doesn't burden working people. So that's his kind of his shift there. So we're now waiting to find out, well, what is he going to do then, which doesn't burden working people? He says, we've scrapped plans on heat pumps and energy efficiency, which would have cost families thousands of pounds. So that's something that they've done in the past. So we want to know what they're going to do in the future. They've scrapped these plans to have heat pumps, which he says will help people to improve energy efficiency and cut bills. Okay, so how are we going to do that? We won't force them to. We'll support nature across the UK. And that's the end of it. We don't find out what it is that he's going to do in a pragmatic way, which doesn't burden working people.
No. And he talks about investment in several things in quite vague terms, as you say. I mean, the option that was there, of course, to subsidise the heat pumps and these other things so that they weren't costing people. That was it. That they became unpopular. Therefore, he's ditching them in a populist move to say, look, we realise we don't want to be the meddling government. And it comes down to free will and free choice. And this is a very, very British argument, isn't it?
Yeah.
We don't want to be forced into anything. We should have free choice. It's all voluntarism.
Yeah. Well, you're waiting for the punchline. Is we don't want to burden the working poor, so we'll pay for it. We'll pay for the heat pumps. That's what you're sort of waiting for.
Yeah, exactly.
And instead you get, well, we've just scrapped the requirement, and you can do it if you want to, but we're not going to. Which doesn't seem like any way to.
No, it's interesting. And Al Jaber takes it a different way because he says we do need to pour money into the global, or the North needs to pour money into the global South for these mitigation measures and adaptation measures, so that the global South isn't left behind. But Sunak decides to sort of take an argument, which is, so we won't bother.
Yeah,
because you don't like it, guys.
And certainly no detail. I think this sort of said will help people to improve energy efficiency. It doesn't say how and so on. And we've there's been several announcements of what the UK is going to be doing over the course of the past few days, which includes a ban on uprooting trees, which is good. A new national park in England, again, which is good as well. And also a ban on advertising for single-use vapes, again, which seems to be a decent thing to do.
But not world-shattering, I would say.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to be on the same scale as
No, and vapes
uh,
are obviously something that people are up in arms against young people taking vapes, which is a bad thing, I would say. But vapes is, just ban these and get an easy hit, but not really going to save the planet.
yeah, yeah. And so those are the kinds of things that are kind of been announced while this conference has been going on. When we're talking about, being at the crossroads of carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, climate change, climate crisis, and all the rest of it. So yeah, it's a bit of a mismatch between
Yeah.
the words that have been said and the actions that have been taken.
No.
And there's there's a precedent. I mean, it's interesting that you say there, Tom, about the British discourse of free choice and being allowed to do things in your own way. The last time there was a huge energy transition, so I did a little bit of research on the privatization of the UK gas industry. And at that time, the state changed every gas pipe in the whole country within a very short space of time. And the taxpayer paid for it. It wasn't about individuals. And that included every single gas cooker in the country having to have its gas rings changed. So
Oh, I
energy
remember. I'm
came. Do
sure
you
my
remember
age.
it?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
And so at no cost to the consumer, all of these things were changed across the whole nation. Every single gas hob had to be changed to have the new natural gas rather than. So there is a precedent in Britain, fairly recent, in living memory, Tom, about an energy transition, perhaps not the kind of one that we would want now, but certainly you can do these things and be the envy of your kind of close rivals, I guess.
No,
So there is a different precedent and a different way of
yeah,
doing
it's
things.
interesting because I don't want to think it was that long ago because that would make me older. But I think that this is. I forget sometimes that I was born in what could be called the post-war era. So 17 years after the Second World War finished, but still, it was quite a different world in terms of there was still the idea that the government arranged stuff for us and that we did stuff and the government made us do stuff. And that, so it's not always been that case. This has been a topos, if you like, that's been increasing in the UK progressively.
Yeah.
Well, let's say particularly since 1979, but actually before 1979, the Thatcher never got in. There's that conflict's been around for a while. Yeah, interesting. But it's also, I think going back to the argumentation strategy, I think that Sunak, as you say, uses this idea that no one, the man in the street should not be left behind or face an intolerable burden. We've got to be pragmatic. He uses that argument to say, so we're not going to enforce anything. Whereas Al Jaber does have a lot more to say and a lot more suggestions. But what he does, he says there are three things that they should be concentrating on that they haven't been necessarily concentrating on all the time. Let me just find them. Mitigation, adaptation, and means of implementation. So he talks about the means of implementation is lots of money going to the Global South to enable it to do stuff, the means being the capital, the money. Adaptation means learning to live with climate change, and he focuses on that a fair bit. But then in terms of mitigation, this is where you might expect, let's stop burning fossil fuels. But he doesn't. He does talk about creating a lot of green energy and a lot of alternative fuels, which is great. And he talks about the transition away from unabated coal. Doesn't mention oil. Oil and coal, I think, come from the same thing at different time periods, but whatever. Unabated coal. But he doesn't talk about that. So what he does, he very cleverly constructs another argument, which is saying we've got to be pragmatic. We mustn't leave the global south behind. And that means spending all this money creating alternative energies. But in a way, he sort of uses that. It's unsaid here because he doesn't mention reducing oil production. But in other places, including the video with the Zoom with Mary Robinson and others, he actually is accused of expanding, an accusation he doesn't deny. He changes the tone of the argument. So in a way, he's making the case that we mustn't leave the global south behind. Therefore, we can keep producing oil to help them develop as long as we keep doing this other stuff like creating alternative energy like wind, etc. And that's all those arguments are good apart from the fact that therefore we don't need to stop producing oil because all these other things will take care of it, like throwing money at the problem and the brilliant entrepreneurial sector. I think both people mentioned that will solve it, and therefore we don't. You can keep producing coal because you'll find other ways of getting around the problem. Keep producing oil. So his argument's more subtle than Sunak, but it still has this by omission. We can still carry on with oil because we've got all these other measures, and let's just forget about oil, and that's because that's not the main issue.
It's interesting. I'll just read that part out that you've been talking about. Excellencies, I want this COP to be the COP that maximizes momentum on mitigation. Today, countries representing more than 85% of the world's economy are behind COP28's goals of tripling renewable energy capacity by 2030. And we are reaching critical mass on the goal to double energy efficiency by 2030. This is how we will transition away from unabated coal. Let me also encourage countries to establish near zero methane emissions targets as part of the next round of NDCs. Zeroing out methane emissions can make a huge impact in the shortest time frame. So you've got some detail and some specificity. We're thinking about social representation of social action here. You've got some of that, but as you say, what's missing from that the particular section of the speech is this mention of oil. Something that I'm often very, very interested in is representation of social action. I always think you can find something interesting in this. And one of the things I noticed here is that Al Jaber does start talking about oil and gas companies. And that's something that I don't recall seeing in previous COPs. They might talk about oil, they might talk about coal, but they talk about them as nouns, representing some kind of, as though they're social actors. But here he does talk about oil and gas companies. But then, interestingly, he's doing it in a way that praises them. So I'm interested in the strategy here. So let me read this part. Colleagues, let history reflect the fact that this presidency has made a bold choice to proactively engage with oil and gas companies. So I think it's interesting that we're not at the level of specifying particular oil and gas companies, but we are at the level of specifying that there are oil and gas companies who need to be involved in this. We had many hard decisions, he says. Let me tell you, it wasn't easy, but now many of these companies are committing to zeroing out methane emissions by 2030 for the first time. And many national oil companies have adopted net zero 2050 targets for the first time. So he's kind of given some praise to some companies in those industries, but still not naming the companies. I'm grateful that they have stepped up to join this game-changing journey, but I must say it is not enough, and I know that they can do more. They can lead the way, and others must catch up. I think that's really interesting. What do you think, Tom? He's naming these sectors, giving them a bit of praise, saying that they need to do more, but the message is that they are now the leaders in this.
Again, it's a really interesting thing that could be taken both ways.
Yeah.
I would agree from a pragmatic point of view, and when we come on to talk about positive discourse analysis, and they're like, yeah, you've got to work with the oil and the gas sectors and see what you can do. And I think what he's done here is very clever, because this opening speech came after it was already announced, this idea that they'd maybe been making deals in the background. So he's undermining an argument. He doesn't refer to that argument. I'm fairly certain it was out there before this came out, and I don't know if they modified the speech because of that. But he's sort of, another form of argumentation is to undermine your opponent's argument. And so he's doing this quite cleverly by not referring to it, but by turning it into a virtue. I've engaged with oil and gas companies, which of course is a great thing. We do need all sectors on board, all gatekeepers on board, all stakeholders on board. But that depends what you're doing. If you're actually having planned to expand oil exploration in the North Sea and in Brazil, then it's not so good. She's quite cleverly subverted that. He's made, again, a very good argument. He's based a solid argument that all parties must be included. Let's call that another topos, all stakeholders must be included in meaningful debate. Very good, great topos. But then it depends what you do with that. So again, he's made himself look very pragmatic as a businessman dealing with these people. He's not just an idealist. We've got to get down to talk with everybody. We've got to be pragmatic. And again, it's this idea of pragmatism, which can be a good thing, but it's pure pragmatism, not leaving people behind, populist and pragmatic, not bad in themselves necessarily, but what is it that then being used to overcome? And that is on Sunak's part doing anything, and on Al Jaber's part, we can continue trading with the oil and gas people. Let's leave that a bit nebulous as to what it means. So he's very clever. He's using sound arguments, sound topoi, but the conclusions he's drawing from that are not necessarily so good.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely right. And as you were saying that, I was just then also remembering back to, we talked about these announcements that the UK government has said about banning advertising on single-use vapes and so on. The other big thing that is not mentioned in Sunak's speech is that they've also committed to what they say maxing out North Sea oil, as you were saying. So allowing new exploration and exploitation of fossil fuel reserves in the North Sea. So what is not said is as important as what is said, as always. And then the match between what is being said and presented versus what we know is happening elsewhere, the actions elsewhere, it doesn't necessarily match here. So, yeah.
And it's interesting that Al Jaber, sorry,
No, go ahead.
North Sea, thinking of the North Sea, you put me on another strand I've been thinking about over the weekend as we were preparing for this, and the idea that, so in the discussion with Mary Robinson and this claim that there is no evidence that fossil fuels are necessary, again, it wasn't said at the COP, but it's part of, intertextuality, part of the background of what Al Jaber has said. Downplaying science. Interestingly, in this speech, he said the science has spoken, so when science suits him, he'll quote it. But this idea, that people want to believe this, and this is something I think that I've forgotten to put up, is, people will believe what they want to believe in order to make a living. Because, yes, they're absolutely like the most basic human thing we have to make a living for our families. And so if we're conflicted because providing for our families is not good for the environment, and someone comes along and says, you know what, those guys who say it's bad for the environment, they're actually wrong, so you can just carry on now and it's great, and you can carry on being a good family man, family woman, whatever. I mean, this we see all the time. I would love the science to say that there is no problem with oil production because, hey, I'm in favour of Scottish independence, and yet when Nicola Sturgeon says we're going to bankroll into exploration of oil in the North Sea, so sure, I've got no vested interest to say that oil is dirty, but unfortunately, it is.
Yeah. And you've got I mean, what we've ended up with, going back to the argumentation here is, yes, in Sunak's speech, you've got this idea that it's either climate change or it's burdening the working people, and the only way to solve, so that you've got a conflict between those two aims, and the only way to do it, to bridge that divide, is to allow people to do it by themselves.
Yeah.
So yeah, what he's not saying is that there is a completely different alternative, which is that governments can regulate, governments can legislate, governments can bring policy to bear, but also in terms of international relations, they can come to international agreements, which is what the kind of whole COP is about, and does not have to have one or the other. A green economy is make the green economy good for everybody. It's I guess what we're ending up with. Yeah.
And Al Jaber comes to a different conclusion, which is you do throw money at it, but this time it's from the global north, who he's put as an outgroup in a way towards the less developed countries. So again, he's reducing the burden on the everyday person, if you like, the people who could be left behind, but in a very different way.
Yeah.
Which Sunak can't do because we are the industrialized north.
Yeah. Yeah. And what we've got, I mean, if we kind of draw this together, they're both riffing on this idea of a just transition without necessarily saying it, which very neatly brings us to
I saw what you did there.
The topic of our next podcast, which we'll be recording, I think the day after tomorrow, is it, Tom? There's a theme. We move now from this leaders event into some of the thematic days, and one of the thematic days, which is about to occur, if it's not already happening right now, is on the idea of just transitions. And we've spoken about that in the last episode, Tom. That's something that you're particularly interested in. In terms of research, we're all interested in it anyway, but you're particularly interested in terms of your research. So
Yeah.
we'll be looking at that in a little bit more detail in the next episode. Yeah. Any last words on that?
See you on Wednesday.
Yeah, see you on Wednesday. Okay, thanks a lot. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye.